14,372 pallets. That was the count I submitted on the morning the last void-capable transport cleared orbital insertion. I stood in Bay 7 Alpha with my data slate, watching servitors stack ammunition crates in columns that reached the vaulted ceiling, and I logged every serial number, every weight specification, every destination code. The bay smelled like machine oil and the particular staleness that comes from recycled air, pushed through filtration systems older than most of the men who would use what we were cataloging. 14,372 pallets. I believed that number meant something then. My name was Hadrian Voss. I was 26 years old. I had served in the Munitorum for 8 years, transferred from the Schola Progenium where I had tested poorly for command track, but demonstrated what my instructors called an aptitude for systems management. They meant I could count things and remember where I put them. In the Imperium's logistical apparatus, this constituted a valuable skill set. I did not question my assignment. I processed requisitions, verified manifests, and ensured that the supplies flowing through the staging areas matched the projections calculated 3 months prior by analysts who had never set foot on Vardis III. The campaign was in its 4th month when I arrived. Vardis III occupied a strategic position along a supply corridor that High Command had designated critical. The enemy held the northern continent. We held the equatorial zone and were preparing for a push that would require the coordinated movement of 7 armored divisions and 43 infantry regiments across terrain that the initial surveys had described as favorable for mechanized warfare. The local star was a white dwarf that produced light in a spectrum that made everything look washed out, bleached of color. I remember thinking the planet looked tired even before we broke it. I worked in the rear echelon, 30 kilometers behind the forward operating bases, in a facility that had been a manufacturing complex before the invasion. The administratum had repurposed it as a distribution hub. My section managed fuel and ammunition for the central theater. There were 12 of us in the logistics cohort, supervised by Quartermaster Principal Corvinus, a man in his 50s who had overseen supply operations on 6 previous campaigns. He had a mechanical augmentation that replaced his left eye with a targeting reticle that clicked and whirred when he examined manifests. He told me once that he had lost the eye to shrapnel on a world whose name he could no longer recall. The replacement was more useful anyway, he said. He could read serial numbers at 30 meters. The facility operated in shifts. My shift began at 0400 hours and continued until the work was complete, which usually meant 14 or 16 hours, depending on transport schedules. I slept in a barracks module with 70 other administrative personnel. The temperature in the module rarely exceeded 12 degrees Celsius. I learned to sleep in my uniform with my coat folded under my head as a pillow. The dreams I had in those early months were about inventory discrepancies, pallets that did not match their shipping codes, containers that arrived empty. I would wake with the sensation that something had been misplaced, something critical, and I would not be able to account for it. The first soldier I met who actually fought was a guardsman from the Cadian 107th. His name was Thorin, or perhaps Torvin. He arrived at the facility driving a damaged Chimera transport that needed replacement track sections. He waited in the requisition queue for 6 hours. I processed his request and authorized the part's release, While the servitors loaded the track sections onto his vehicle, he stood near my station and smoked a glow stick that he had rolled himself. He did not speak much. I asked him what the front was like. He looked at me with an expression I did not understand then. He said it was loud. That was all. It was loud, and sometimes the loudness stopped, and the silence was worse. I logged his requisition and watched him drive back toward the front. The Chimera's damaged track clattered against the road surface. I noted the vehicle's identification number in case it returned. It did not return. 16 days later, the Cadian 107th was listed as having sustained 73% casualties during an engagement near grid designate Tarsus 9. I do not know if Thorin survived. I do not know if I recorded his name correctly. The file has degraded over time. The supplies kept moving. Every morning, shipments arrived from the orbital platforms. Every afternoon, convoys departed for the forward zones. Fuel bowsers rolling in columns, ammunition trucks interspersed with repair vehicles and medical transports. I verified the loads and signed off on the dispatch logs. Quartermaster Principal Corvinus reviewed my work and countersigned. The system functioned because we made it function. That was what he told me. The front line depends on us, he said. Without logistics, wars are not fought. They are simply mass deaths without strategic purpose. I believed him. I took pride in the accuracy of my records. When discrepancies emerged, a shipment listed as delivered but not recorded at the receiving depot, a fuel allotment that exceeded consumption projections. I investigated until I found the error. Usually it was a transcription mistake, a clerk who had transposed digits. Sometimes it was intentional. Supply sergeants who requisitioned extra ammunition to build stockpiles against future shortages. I reported these discrepancies per protocol. Corvinus handled the disciplinary actions. I returned to my manifests. The campaign progressed according to schedule. The front advanced 18 kilometers in the 5th month, 32 in the 6th. The casualty reports came through our facility because everything came through our facility. I saw the numbers. I logged them as I logged everything else. 4,000 dead, 7,000 wounded, 12,000 requiring evacuation to rear echelon medical stations. The numbers increased each week, but so did the territorial gains. High Command transmitted commendations. The operation was proceeding as projected. I met Kellen in the 7th month. He was a Medici orderly assigned to a forward aid station that had been overrun during an enemy counter-offensive. He arrived at our facility with a convoy of wounded, helping to unload stretchers from the backs of requisitioned cargo trucks that still smelled like the rations they had been carrying the day before. I was conducting an inventory check in Bay 3 when he walked past me carrying a plasma canister that had been marked for disposal. He was 23 years old. He had brown hair that he kept short, regulation length, and a scar along his jawline that he said came from a piece of debris that had hit him during an artillery strike. He did not have the mechanical look that some Medicae personnel develop, the detachment that comes from treating injuries as technical problems. He still flinched when the wounded cried out. He was supposed to stay at our facility for 36 hours, while the forward aid station was re-established. He stayed for 9 days. There was a processing delay. The transport that was supposed to return him to the front was diverted to another theater. He spent the days helping in the medical section of our compound. treating administrative personnel for minor injuries and stress-related conditions. He spent the evenings in the enlisted mess, sitting at the long tables and eating ration packs that came from the same supply chain I managed. I spoke with him on the 4th day. I was completing an after-shift inspection, and he was sitting alone near the perimeter of the facility, looking out at the flat terrain that extended toward the horizon. The light from Vardis III's sun made everything look pale, washed out. He asked if I ever went to the front. I told him no. My assignment was here. He nodded. He said he thought that was probably better. We talked for perhaps 20 minutes. He told me about the aid station, the number of casualties they processed each day, the injuries he had seen. He described them clinically, using proper medical terminology, but there was something in the way he spoke that suggested the terminology was not sufficient. A laser gun wound to the abdomen could be described in terms of thermal damage and tissue disruption, but the description did not convey what it meant to watch someone die from it over the course of 6 hours because the medical supplies had not arrived, and there was nothing to give him for the pain. I asked him why he had joined the Medicae Corps. He said he had not joined. He had been assigned. His aptitude tests at the Schola Progenium indicated suitability for medical training. So they trained him. He learned anatomy, pharmacology, field surgery. He learned how to prioritize casualties based on survivability metrics, how to perform amputations with insufficient anesthetic, how to tell a soldier that he was going to die and there was nothing that could be done except make him comfortable, which was a euphemism because comfort was not actually possible. Only varying degrees of suffering that could be slightly reduced if the supply situation allowed. I did not know what to say to that. I told him the supply situation was stable. The projections indicated adequate medical supplies for projected casualty rates. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, the projections did not account for reality. The supplies that reached the forward aid stations were always less than what was listed on the manifests. Sometimes 50% less. Sometimes they did not arrive at all. I told him that was impossible. Every shipment was logged. Every container was verified. He did not argue. He just looked back out at the horizon. After a while, he said that maybe the logs were wrong. Or maybe things got lost between the logs and the actual battlefield. I did not respond. I was thinking about the system, the manifests, the verification protocols, the numbers that I had counted and recorded with precision. He returned to the front on the 9th day. I watched the transport leave. I did not see him again for 11 months, which is not... There is more to say about that. I will return to it. The 8th month was when the pattern began to shift. Small indicators at first. A fuel shipment that arrived 2 days late. An ammunition requisition that could not be filled immediately because the orbital transport had been delayed. Corvinus noted the irregularities in his reports to Division Command. The responses came back with reassurances, temporary disruptions, orbital traffic congestion, nothing that would impact operational capacity. The delays increased, a supply convoy that was attacked en route and lost 30% of its load. Another that was diverted to support a separate theater where enemy activity had intensified. The manifests I processed began to include more frequent shortage notifications. Ammunition allotments reduced by 15%. Fuel deliveries stretched from weekly to every 9 days. Corvinus held briefings with the logistics cohort. He told us to prioritize frontline units, reduce allocations to rear echelon support, defer non-critical maintenance. The campaign was entering a decisive phase, and temporary austerity measures were necessary to maintain offensive momentum. I recalculated the distribution schedules. I identified units that could absorb reductions without immediate operational impact. I submitted the revised projections. They were approved. The supplies continued to move, but the numbers were tighter now. The margins were thinner. I began to notice that the requisitions coming from the front were increasing while our capacity to fulfill them was decreasing. The gap between demand and supply was widening. In the 9th month, I logged the first critical shortage. A mechanized battalion reported fuel reserves at 18%. They had been scheduled to receive a resupply 3 days prior. The shipment had not arrived. I checked the transport logs. The shipment had departed the orbital platform on schedule. It had not reached the surface. No distress signal, no wreckage located. The void-capable transport and its entire cargo had simply failed to arrive. Corvinus escalated the matter. Division Command initiated an investigation. The investigation concluded that the transport had likely been destroyed during descent, possibly by enemy anti-orbital fire that had not been detected. The battalion received an emergency fuel allocation drawn from reserves intended for a different unit. The other unit's advance was delayed by 48 hours as a result. The delay was noted in the operational reports as acceptable friction. The shortages multiplied. By the 10th month, I was processing more shortage notifications than fulfilled requisitions. Ammunition stockpiles at forward operating bases were dropping below the thresholds established by tactical doctrine. Fuel reserves that were supposed to maintain a 30-day buffer were down to 11 days. Medical supplies were being rationed. Corvinus stopped holding briefings. He spent his days in direct communication with Division Command, requesting, demanding explanations for why the supply chain that had functioned flawlessly for 9 months was now degrading with increasing speed. The answer came in the 11th month, though it was not delivered as an answer. It was delivered as an operational update. The enemy had established void superiority in the system's outer orbits. 3 Imperial Navy vessels had been destroyed or disabled. The remaining naval assets had withdrawn to defensive positions around the primary orbital platform. Cargo transports could no longer make planetfall without significant risk of interdiction. Supply deliveries would be reduced to critical shipments only until naval superiority was re-established. The timeline for re-establishing superiority was classified. I read the operational update 3 times. I understood what it meant. The supply chain had not degraded. It had been severed. Everything we needed was still in orbit, sitting in warehouses on platforms that we could see from the surface if we looked up at night. But it could not reach us, and we could not reach it. Corvinus summoned the logistics cohort. He looked older than he had 2 months prior. The mechanical eye clicked as it focused on each of us in turn. He told us that our mission parameters had changed. We were no longer managing distribution. We were managing scarcity. Every requisition that we approved meant denying another. Every liter of fuel we allocated to one unit was a liter unavailable to someone else. We would receive no further guidance from Division Command beyond priority designations. The decisions were ours to make. He asked if anyone had questions. No one spoke. He dismissed us. I returned to my station and looked at the manifests that covered my desk. Requisitions from 40 units, all marked urgent. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, rations, replacement parts for vehicles that were breaking down because maintenance schedules could no longer be maintained. I had enough stockpiled supplies to fulfill perhaps 1/3 of the requests. I would have to choose which units received what they needed and which units did not. I began with tactical priority assessments. Frontline combat units received allocation preference. Mechanized divisions came second. Artillery batteries third. Support and logistics elements last. I approved what I could. I denied the rest. I submitted the allocation schedule to Corvinus. He reviewed it and countersigned without comment. The next morning, I received notification that one of the units I denied, a rear echelon maintenance company, had been overrun during an enemy raid. They had requested ammunition for defensive positions. I had classified their request as non-critical because they were not a combat unit. 27 personnel were killed. The notification listed them by name and serial number. I archived the notification and continued processing requisitions. That was the complicity moment, I think. Not the only one, but the first. I made a decision based on available data and institutional priorities. The decision resulted in deaths that might have been prevented. I did not protest. I did not request transfer or refuse further assignments. I accepted that this was now the nature of my function. I would allocate resources knowing that every allocation was also a sentence delivered to whoever did not receive what they had requested. I continued processing requisitions because requisitions still needed to be processed, and there was no one else to do it. Kellen returned in the 12th month. His convoy arrived without advance notification, a column of damaged vehicles carrying wounded who could no longer be treated at the forward aid stations because the aid stations had run out of medical supplies. He climbed down from the back of a truck that had been hit by shrapnel. His uniform was covered in blood that had dried to a dark brown color. He saw me across the facility yard. He walked over. He did not say anything. He just stood there looking at me with an expression that I recognized now. I asked him if he needed medical attention. He said no. The blood was not his. I asked what had happened at the front. He said everything. Everything had happened. The offensive had stalled 3 weeks ago when the armored divisions ran out of fuel. The tanks were abandoned in place, crews ordered to fall back to defensive positions on foot. The infantry was low on ammunition. Soldiers were scavenging rounds from enemy corpses. Some were using enemy weapons because Imperial lace guns required power cells that were no longer available in sufficient quantities. The enemy had recognized the situation and intensified their attacks. They knew we could not sustain defensive fire for extended periods. They could simply advance and wait for us to run out of ammunition. I told him we were doing everything possible to maintain supply flow. He laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. He said we were not doing anything. We were managing collapse. There was a difference. He stayed at the facility for 6 days that time. He slept in the medical section. He treated the wounded who kept arriving in convoys that came every few hours. He worked until he could not stand. Then he slept for 4 hours and worked again. I brought him rations from my allocation. He ate without acknowledging the food. On the 4th day, I found him sitting in the same place where we had talked before, looking out at the horizon. I sat down next to him. I did not know what to say. I asked if there was anything I could do. He turned to look at me. His eyes were red. He had not slept enough. He said there was nothing anyone could do. The system had failed, not because of incompetence or sabotage, simply because the system depended on assumptions that were no longer valid. The projections assumed supply continuity. The tactical plans assumed resource availability. The casualty estimates assumed medical support. All of those assumptions were now inoperative. We were fighting a war with an army that was dissolving under logistical starvation. I wanted to tell him that Division Command was working to resolve the situation, that naval assets would re-establish void superiority, that supplies would resume flowing and the front would stabilize. I did not say any of that because I did not believe it, and I thought he deserved better than a recitation of institutional reassurances that meant nothing. Instead, I told him about the requisitions I was processing, the decisions I was making, the units I was condemning by denying their requests because there was not enough to give everyone what they needed. I told him I did not know if I was making the correct choices. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said there were no correct choices. There were only choices that killed different people. That was what rationing meant. I was deciding who lived and who died based on strategic value calculations. He said it without accusation, just observation. I asked him if he blamed me. He said no. I was doing what I had been ordered to do. So was he. So was everyone. The system required our compliance to function, and we complied because we had been trained to comply, and because refusing to comply would not save anyone. It would just mean that someone else would make the same decisions and produce the same outcomes. He said he understood that. He just wished understanding made it easier. He left on the 6th day. I watched the transport depart. I wanted to stop him, to tell him to stay at the facility where it was safer, where he would not have to return to the front and watch more men die because the supplies I was supposed to provide were not reaching them. I did not stop him. He had his orders. I had mine. That was the last time I saw him. Alive, I mean. There is more to say about that. I will continue. The facility received new orders in the 13th month. Division Command was implementing emergency consolidation protocols. All remaining fuel and ammunition reserves were to be allocated to designated priority units. These units would maintain defensive positions along contracted perimeter lines. All other units were to be abandoned in place. The phrasing was different. Strategic redeployment, operational consolidation, but the meaning was clear. We were withdrawing. We were leaving thousands of soldiers at the front, without the supplies to fight or retreat. Corvinus refused to implement the orders. He transmitted a response to Division Command, noting that the abandonment of frontline units violated operational doctrine and constituted a de facto death sentence for the affected personnel. Division Command replied that the orders were not subject to review or appeal. Corvinus was relieved of command. A replacement quartermaster arrived within 6 hours, a major whose name I do not remember. He implemented the consolidation protocols immediately. I processed the allocation schedules. I watched the supply convoys depart for the priority units. I listened to the Vox traffic from the units that were not receiving supplies, requests for ammunition, pleas for medical evacuation, soldiers reporting that they were under attack and had no means of defense. The Vox traffic lasted for 3 days. Then it stopped. The units had been overrun or scattered. I logged them as combat ineffective in the casualty database. 18,000 personnel. That was the count. I archived the number and continued processing requisitions for the units that remained. The Medicaid convoys stopped arriving. There was nowhere for the wounded to go. The rear echelon medical facilities were being evacuated. The wounded who could not be moved were left behind with whatever medical supplies could be spared, which was almost none. I received a requisition from a field hospital requesting analgesics for 73 wounded personnel who are going to die over the next several days. The hospital had no transport to evacuate them. They wanted something to make the dying easier. I had 6 units of morphine-equivalent compounds in the stockpile. It was not enough for 73 people. It was enough for perhaps 12 if administered correctly. I approved the allocation. I did not know if it reached them. I did not follow up. I could not follow up. I was processing 40 requisitions a day and denying 35 of them. There was no time for follow-up. Kellen was at that field hospital. I did not learn this until later. He had been assigned there when his aid station was overrun. He had stayed with the wounded when the evacuation orders came through. He was listed as missing for 6 weeks before the status was updated to deceased. The casualty report did not specify cause of death. It listed the date and grid coordinates. The field hospital's location. I accessed the report multiple times. I archived it. The file is still intact. I think about the morphine allocation often. 12 people. That is how many could have received sufficient dosage to die without significant pain. Kellen would have had to choose which 12. Or perhaps he distributed the morphine evenly among all 73, knowing that it would not be enough for any of them, but also that it was all there was. I do not know what he chose. The system did not record that level of detail. His death occurred in the 14th month. By then, the consolidation was complete. The front line had contracted to a defensive perimeter roughly 1/3 the size of the original operational area. The surviving units were fortifying positions with whatever materials they could salvage. Ammunition was rationed at 5 rounds per soldier per day. Fuel was reserved exclusively for command vehicles and essential generators. Food supplies were projected to last 8 more weeks at reduced ration levels. After that, starvation would begin affecting combat effectiveness. Division Command transmitted optimistic assessments. Naval reinforcements were en route. Void superiority would be re-established within 90 days. Supply deliveries would resume. The consolidated perimeter could be maintained until relief arrived. The soldiers were ordered to hold their positions. They were told that their sacrifice was necessary for the greater strategic objective. They were told the Imperium would not abandon them. The soldiers held their positions because they had no alternative. Retreat was not possible. The enemy controlled the surrounding territory. Surrender was not considered. We had been trained from the Schola Progenium onward that surrender was not an acceptable outcome under any circumstance. So they held, and they died holding. The casualty reports continued to arrive until the Vox network became too degraded to maintain consistent communication. I remained at the facility for another month. The facility itself was now within 30 kilometers of the front line, which meant it was within artillery range. We began taking intermittent fire in the 15th month. Servitors continued moving supplies according to their programming even as shells impacted the compound. I continued processing requisitions even though there was almost nothing left to allocate. The stockpiles were exhausted. The warehouses were empty. I was approving requests by redistributing supplies that had already been allocated elsewhere, stealing from one unit to give to another, creating a circular pattern of deprivation that resolved nothing. The facility was evacuated in the 16th month. The remaining logistics personnel were transferred to the orbital platform. I was among them. I carried nothing with me except my data slate, which contained copies of every manifest I had processed since arriving on Vardis 3. 14,372 pallets at the beginning. By the end, the number was 0. I had allocated everything. It had not been enough. The evacuation transport lifted from the surface under fire. I looked down at the planet as we ascended. The defensive perimeter was visible as a line of fortifications that glowed faintly in the pale light of the dying sun. Somewhere within that perimeter were soldiers who had requested supplies I could not provide. They were still holding their positions because they had been ordered to hold them. I wondered how long they would continue to hold after the last ammunition was expended. The naval reinforcements arrived 4 months later. By then, the defensive perimeter had been overrun. The surviving Imperial forces on Vardis 3 numbered fewer than 2,000, scattered across the planet in isolated pockets. The relief operation recovered approximately 300 personnel. The rest were listed as casualties or missing. The final count was 68,000 dead. The campaign was classified as a strategic withdrawal. The after-action reports noted significant lessons learned regarding supply chain vulnerabilities and the importance of maintaining void superiority during extended ground operations. I was reassigned to another theater, another campaign, another logistics facility where I processed manifests and allocated supplies according to projections calculated by analysts who had never set foot in the operational area. The work was the same. The system was the same. I performed my function because I had been trained to perform my function, and because the alternative was to refuse, which would accomplish nothing except my own removal from the system. The data slate remained with me. I transferred the manifests from Vardis 3 into the new facility's archive network. No one ever reviewed them. No one asked about the discrepancies between projected consumption rates and actual delivery capacity. No one questioned why 68,000 soldiers had died in a campaign that had possessed adequate supplies at the beginning, but none at the end. The system did not learn from Vardis III because the system was not designed to learn. It was designed to continue. The second campaign was on a world called Gorum Prime. I arrived in the 9th month of the operation. The planet was a forge world that had fallen to enemy control and was being contested through siege operations that High Command projected would last 3 years minimum. My assignment was to a forward logistics depot responsible for supplying 2 siege regiments and an armored support battalion. The facility was built into the ruins of a manufactorum complex that still radiated heat from machinery that had been destroyed 6 months earlier. The walls were scorched black. The air tasted like burned metal. I reported to Quartermaster Captain Dren, who reviewed my service record and noted my previous deployment. He asked if I had recommendations based on my experience at Vardis III. I told him to maintain supply buffers above projected requirements. He said that was already protocol. I did not mention that protocol had also existed at Vardis III. I signed the transfer documents and began processing requisitions. The work was identical. Manifests arrived. I verified contents against shipping codes. I authorized distributions based on priority assessments. Convoys departed for the siege lines carrying ammunition and fuel and rations in quantities that matched the projections. The system functioned. I observed its functioning and documented the data, because that was my purpose. But I was different now. I recognized patterns that I had not seen before. The way requisitions increased gradually over time as combat intensity escalated. The way supply deliveries remained constant, even as demand grew. The way the gap between the two widened slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the margins were gone and every allocation decision became a choice about who would go without. I watched the pattern develop at Gorum Prime exactly as it had developed at Vardis III, and I understood that this was not an anomaly. This was the system operating as designed. I logged every discrepancy, every late shipment, every shortage notification. I compiled the data into reports that I submitted to Quartermaster Captain Dren. He acknowledged the reports and filed them with Division Command. Division Command responded with reassurances. The supply situation was stable. Projected consumption rates were within acceptable parameters. Temporary disruptions did not indicate systemic failure. The reports continued. The reassurances continued. The gap continued to widen. In the 14th month, I met Varen. He was a tank commander whose Leman Russ had thrown a track during a siege assault. He came to the depot personally to expedite the requisition for replacement parts because his company was undermanned and could not afford to lose a functional vehicle. He was older than me, perhaps 40, with the kind of facial scarring that suggested long service in combat zones. His hands shook slightly when he held the requisition form. I noticed, but did not comment. The parts he needed were in stock. I authorized the release and arranged for a transport to deliver them to his position. The process took 20 minutes. He waited at my station the entire time, watching me work. When I handed him the authorization confirmation, he asked how long I'd been doing this. I told him 4 years. He asked if it got easier. I did not know how to answer that. I said the work was consistent. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded and left. His tank was destroyed 3 weeks later during an engagement at the outer siege perimeter. The after-action report indicated that the vehicle had sustained a direct hit from enemy anti-armor fire. The crew survived the initial impact, but were killed while attempting to evacuate the disabled vehicle. Varen's name was listed first in the casualty notification. I archived the report. I continued processing requisitions. The second soldier was named Merrick. He was a company supply sergeant who coordinated logistics for an infantry regiment at the forward siege positions. He came to the depot every 8 days to collect allocated supplies and transport them to the front. He was efficient and professional. He never requested more than his allotment. He never complained about shortages. He simply accepted what was available and made it work. We did not speak beyond what was required for the transactions, but I observed him. The way he counted every crate before signing the receipt. The way he inspected the seals on ammunition containers to verify they had not been tampered with. The way he organized his transport convoy for maximum efficiency, placing the most critical supplies in the center vehicles where they would be most protected if the convoy was attacked during the return journey. In the 16th month, his requisitions began to change. He started requesting smaller quantities than his regiment's authorized allotment. When I asked why, he said his unit had learned to make supplies last longer. They were firing fewer rounds per engagement, rationing rations, extending maintenance intervals. He said it as if it was a positive development. Operational efficiency improvements. I understood what he was actually describing. His regiment was starving and had stopped wasting ammunition on suppressive fire because they knew the ammunition would not be replaced. I increased his allocation. I pulled supplies from the buffer reserves that Dren had ordered maintained for emergency situations. Merrick accepted the increase without comment. He signed the receipt and departed. He returned 8 days later for the next collection. The pattern continued for 3 months. In the 19th month, someone else came to collect his regiment's allocation, a lieutenant I had not seen before. I asked where Merrick was. The lieutenant said he had been killed during an enemy raid on a supply convoy. The convoy had been ambushed 12 kilometers from the front. Merrick had stayed with the vehicles trying to save the supplies while the escort troops fought off the attackers. He had died defending a truck carrying ration crates. The lieutenant delivered this information in a flat tone that suggested he had delivered many such notifications recently. I processed the allocation for the new supply sergeant. I did not ask his name. I did not want to know his name. I authorized the supply release and watched the convoy depart. That evening I accessed Merrick's casualty file. The report listed cause of death as lasgun wounds to the chest and abdomen. Time of death was estimated based on the convoy's last communication. There had been no recovery of remains. The ambush site had been overrun by enemy forces before Imperial troops could secure it. I had known Merrick for 11 months. I had spoken perhaps 300 words to him total. He had never told me anything about himself. I did not know where he was from or why he had joined the Guard or if he had family somewhere waiting for word that would never come. I knew only that he had been competent at his function and that his death had occurred while performing that function, and that someone else would now perform that function until they also died performing it. The third was a Medicaid officer named Strand. He ran a field hospital at the secondary siege line. His requisitions came through my station because medical supplies fell under my processing authority. He never came to the depot personally. He submitted his requests through the Vox network and waited for delivery. His requests were always precise. Specific compounds in specific quantities for specific medical procedures. He understood supply chain limitations and adjusted his requests accordingly. I approved his requisitions when possible. I denied them when the supplies he needed were not available or had been allocated to higher priority units. The denials increased in frequency as the campaign progressed. By the 20th month, I was denying more than half his requests. He never protested. He simply acknowledged the denial and submitted a revised request for whatever alternatives existed. In the 22nd month, he submitted a requisition for a large quantity of sedatives and analgesics. The quantity was unusual, too large for routine medical operations. I queried the request. He responded via Vox. His hospital was being evacuated. He had 47 wounded personnel who could not be transported. They were going to be left behind. He wanted enough medication to ensure they would not suffer when the enemy reached the hospital. I checked the stockpile. I had sufficient supplies to fulfill the request. I checked the priority designations. Medical supplies for non-transportable casualties were classified as low priority. Protocol required me to deny the requisition and reallocate the supplies to units that had higher operational value. I approved the requisition. I authorized the release and arranged for immediate delivery. I falsified the allocation codes to indicate the supplies were for a higher priority unit. Dren would review the logs eventually and discover the discrepancy. I did not care. Strand needed the supplies immediately, or they would be useless. The delivery was made. Strand acknowledged receipt. 4 days later, his hospital was overrun. The casualty report listed him among the dead. Cause of death was not specified. I accessed the file multiple times trying to find additional details. There were none. He had died at his station. That was all the system recorded. I thought about the 47 wounded personnel. I thought about whether Strand had administered the medication before the enemy arrived, or if the attack had come too quickly. I thought about whether the falsified allocation had actually accomplished anything, or if it had simply been a gesture that made me feel marginally less complicit in their deaths. I did not reach a conclusion. I archived the file and continued processing requisitions. Dren discovered the falsified allocation 6 weeks later. He summoned me to his office and showed me the discrepancy in the logs. He asked for an explanation. I told him I had authorized the allocation to a medical unit that had required immediate resupply. He asked why I'd falsified the priority codes. I said I had determined that the medical need exceeded the operational value calculation. He was quiet for a long time. His expression did not change. Finally, he said that I had violated protocol and exceeded my authority. The falsification constituted misconduct that warranted disciplinary action. He could refer the matter to the commissariat or handle it internally. He asked if I had anything to say. I told him I understood the violation. I told him I would not contest disciplinary action. I told him that 47 soldiers had died with sufficient medication to make their deaths less agonizing, and that I consider that outcome acceptable regardless of the consequences to myself. He dismissed me without rendering a decision. I returned to my station and continued working. 3 days later, he summoned me again. He said he had reviewed the matter thoroughly. He said that upon further analysis, the allocation had been appropriate given the tactical situation at the time. The priority codes had been correct. There was no discrepancy. He had updated the logs to reflect the proper classification. I understood what he was doing. He was protecting me from the consequences of a decision he agreed with but could not openly endorse. I thanked him. He told me not to do it again. We both knew I would if the situation arose. We both knew he would not actually stop me. The system required our compliance, but the system also created situations where compliance was indistinguishable from murder. And sometimes the only moral choice was to violate the system and accept the consequences. The consequences came in the 24th month, not for the falsified allocation, for everything else. The supply chain at Gorum Prime degraded the same way it had degraded at Vardis III. Orbital traffic disruptions, enemy void superiority, transport losses, delivery delays that became delivery suspensions. The siege regiments that had been consuming supplies at projected rates for 2 years suddenly found themselves operating with half rations and quarter ammunition allotments. The armored battalion abandoned 16 of their 30 tanks because there was no fuel to operate them. The artillery batteries reduced fire missions by 70%. The siege lines held because the soldiers manning them had no alternative except to hold until they ran out of ammunition or the enemy overran their positions. Division Command implemented consolidation protocols. Priority units received continued supply. Non-priority units were reclassified as expendable. I processed the allocation schedules. I denied requisitions from units I knew would be overrun without supplies. I submitted the schedules to Dren. He reviewed them. He countersigned. He looked older every time I saw him. The weight of the decisions was visible in the way he moved. Slower, more carefully, as if each step required conscious thought. The facility took direct fire in the 26th month. Enemy artillery had advanced close enough to range our position. Shells impacted the compound at irregular intervals. We continued working between bombardments. Servitors continued moving supplies according to their programming even when shrapnel cut them down. We dragged the damaged servitors out of the way and resumed processing manifests because the manifests still needed processing, and stopping would not make the artillery stop. Dren was killed during a bombardment in the 27th month. A shell penetrated the facility's roof and detonated in the administrative section. He was at his desk reviewing allocation schedules. The explosion killed him and 4 other logistics personnel instantly. I was in the warehouse bay at the time. I heard the impact. I felt the shock wave through the floor. I returned to the administrative section after the fires were extinguished and saw what remained of the room. They recovered his body in pieces. The casualty report listed cause of death as fragmentation wounds and thermal trauma. I processed his death the same way I'd processed thousands of others. I logged his name and service number. I archived the file. I assumed his responsibilities because there was no one else to assume them and the requisitions still needed processing. I functioned as acting quartermaster for 3 months. The work was identical to what I had been doing before, except now I had no one to review my decisions. I approved allocations. I denied allocations. I falsified priority codes when necessary. I stole from low-priority units to supply high-priority units. I managed scarcity exactly as Dren had managed it, making choices that killed people while telling myself that the alternative choices would kill different people, and that this was the best outcome available within the constraints I operated under. In the 30th month, the facility was evacuated. The siege had failed. The regiments that had spent 3 years trying to recapture Gorum Prime were withdrawing to orbital transports, while enemy forces pressed the collapsing perimeter. I received orders to destroy all remaining supplies and evacuate with the final transport. I verified the destruction charges were properly placed. I activated the timers. I watched the warehouse bays burn as the transport lifted from the surface. The casualties at Gorum Primes totaled 93,000. The campaign was classified as operationally inconclusive. The world remained under enemy control. The after-action reports noted that supply chain disruptions had significantly impacted combat effectiveness. Recommendations included improved orbital defense protocols and increased supply buffer stockpiles. The recommendations were identical to the recommendations from Vardis III. I was reassigned again and again and again. Koresh IV. Morton's World. Caldris Prime. 17 campaigns across 11 years. The names changed. The terrain changed. The enemy changed. The work never changed. I processed manifests. I allocated supplies. I watched the supply chains degrade according to the same pattern every time. Initial sufficiency, gradual shortage development, critical deprivation, systemic collapse, evacuation, casualty counts that reached 5 figures or 6 figures, after-action reports that noted lessons learned but never implemented changes that would prevent the pattern from repeating. I stopped learning the names of soldiers who came to the depots. I stopped reading casualty files unless required for administrative purposes. I stopped submitting reports about supply discrepancies because the reports accomplished nothing except creating documentation that no one reviewed. I performed my function. I made my decisions. I killed people with every allocation I approved and every allocation I denied. The system required this. I complied because I had been trained to comply, and because I no longer believed that refusal would accomplish anything except my own removal from a position where I could occasionally make choices that saved a few people, even as I condemned many others. The 18th campaign was on a moon called Tergus VI. I arrived in the 14th month of the operation. The fighting was concentrated in a network of underground tunnels that had been mining facilities before the war. The logistics depot was on the surface, built into a crater that provided some protection from orbital observation. I reported to the quartermaster, a colonel named Var who had been managing supply operations for 3 years. He reviewed my record and noted my extensive deployment history. He said I was experienced. I told him experience had taught me that the system always failed eventually. He said that was correct. Then he assigned me to my station and I began processing requisitions. The pattern developed exactly as I knew it would. Sufficient supplies at first, gradual erosion, increasing shortages, widening gap between demand and capacity. By the 20th month, I was rationing ammunition at 3 rounds per soldier per day. By the 22nd month, I was rationing food at half portions. By the 24th month, I was processing requisitions for units that had no ammunition, no food, and no realistic prospect of receiving either. In the 26th month, I was alone in the depot when a soldier arrived asking for supplies. He was young, perhaps 19, with a kind of malnourished appearance that suggested he had been operating on reduced rations for months. He had walked 14 kilometers from his position in the tunnels to reach the depot because his unit's Vox equipment had failed and he could not submit the requisition through normal channels. He told me his squad needed ammunition. They were defending a tunnel junction that controlled access to a critical sector. They had 11 rounds remaining. The enemy was massing for an assault. Without ammunition, they would not be able to hold the position. He needed resupply immediately or his squad would be overrun within hours. I checked the stockpiles. I had no ammunition available. The last shipment had been allocated to priority units 3 days earlier. The next shipment was not scheduled to arrive for 6 days. I told him this. He asked if there was anything I could do. Any reserve, any emergency allocation, anything. I could have lied. I could have told him that supplies were coming, that he should return to his position and hold on, that help was on the way. I did not lie. I told him the truth. There was no ammunition. There would be no resupply. His squad was going to die in that tunnel because the system that was supposed to support them had failed, and there was nothing I could do to change that. He looked at me without speaking. His expression did not change. After a long moment, he nodded. He asked if I had any rations he could take back. At least his squad could eat before they died. I gave him 4 days' worth of rations from my personal allocation. He thanked me. He left. I watched him walk back toward the tunnels, carrying the rations in a pack that looked too large for his malnourished frame. I never learned his name. I never learned if his squad survived. The tunnel sector he mentioned was overrun 4 days later. Casualty estimates for that engagement exceeded 200. I do not know if he was among them. The system did not record individual deaths with that level of detail. It recorded unit designations and casualty percentages. His squad was listed as destroyed. That was all. I thought about that soldier often in the years that followed. The way he had accepted my answer without protest or accusation. The way he had asked for rations so his squad could at least eat before they died. The way he had thanked me for 4 days' worth of food that would not save them. I thought about how the system had trained us all to accept these outcomes as inevitable, to process them as operational friction rather than moral catastrophes, to continue functioning even as we participated in the machinery that consumed us. The depot at Tergus 6 was evacuated in the 31st month. I destroyed the remaining supplies per protocol. The charges detonated as the transport cleared the surface. I looked down at the moon as we ascended. Somewhere in those tunnels were soldiers who had requested supplies I could not provide. They were still fighting because they had been ordered to fight and because the system did not provide mechanisms for questioning orders. I wondered how many of them would survive long enough to be evacuated. I wondered if survival was preferable to dying in the tunnels. I did not reach a conclusion. The pattern continued. Campaign after campaign, world after world. The system failing in exactly the same way every time, while the after-action reports documented the failures and recommended solutions that were never implemented, because implementing solutions would require acknowledging that the system itself was the failure. In the 34th year of my service, I was assigned to a logistics coordination facility on an orbital station. This was not a field deployment. This was a strategic-level position, managing supply flow for an entire sector. I reported to a logistics directorate that oversaw the work of 300 analysts and coordinators. My function was to review allocation requests from planetary campaigns and approve or deny them based on available resources and strategic priorities. I no longer saw the soldiers. I no longer processed individual requisitions. I reviewed summary reports that listed units by designation and supply levels by percentage. A mechanized division at 63% ammunition capacity. An infantry corps at 42% ration adequacy. A siege regiment requesting emergency resupply. Numbers, percentages, designations. The human beings those numbers represented were abstracted into data points that I manipulated according to priority matrices developed by analysts who had never set foot in a combat zone. I was competent at this work. I understood the strategic calculations. I could assess competing demands and make allocation decisions that optimized resource distribution across multiple simultaneous campaigns. My efficiency ratings were high. My error rate was low. I received commendations for my performance. The system valued my function, but I remembered. I remembered the soldier at Turgus VI who had walked 14 kilometers to ask for ammunition that did not exist. I remembered Kellen dying at a field hospital without sufficient morphine. I remembered Merrick killed defending supplies that would not save the regiment he had served. I remembered Strand administering mercy to wounded soldiers who were being abandoned. I remembered Varen and his shaking hands and his question about whether it got easier. I remembered all of them even as I approved allocation schedules that would create more of them. Soldiers who would request supplies that would not arrive. Medics who would watch their patients die for lack of basic compounds. Supply sergeants who would die defending convoys carrying inadequate provisions to understaffed units. Tank commanders who would ask if it got easier and never receive an honest answer. The work at the orbital station continued for 8 years. I rose through the administrative hierarchy. I managed larger sections. I coordinated more complex allocation schemes. I participated in strategic planning sessions where we discussed optimal resource distribution across theater-level operations. The discussions were always the same. Not enough supplies for all units. Prioritization required. Acceptable losses calculated. Decisions rendered. In the 42nd year of my service, I was offered promotion to Logistics Director for a subsector command. The position would have placed me in direct authority over supply operations for 15 campaigns simultaneously. I would have been responsible for managing the deprivation that I had spent 4 decades participating in. I would have been the person rendering final decisions about which units receive supplies and which units were left to die without them. I declined the promotion. The refusal was noted in my service record as unexpected given my performance ratings. I was asked to reconsider. I declined again. I was asked for an explanation. I provided none that satisfied the inquiry board. They concluded that extended service in high-stress logistics positions had resulted in degraded decision-making capacity. I was recommended for reassignment to a less demanding position. I was transferred to an archive facility on a minor station in a quiet sector. My function was to catalog historical logistics records, supply manifests from campaigns that had concluded years or decades earlier, casualty reports, after-action assessments, lessons learned documentation. I processed the files and entered them into the archive system according to established protocols. The work was quiet, mechanical. I sat in a small office with a data terminal and reviewed documents that no one would ever read. Campaign after campaign, world after world. The same pattern documented over and over. Initial sufficiency, gradual shortage, critical deprivation, collapse, evacuation, casualties, lessons learned. The system had been failing in exactly the same way for centuries. Every report recommended the same solutions. None of the solutions were ever implemented. I have been at this archive facility for 3 years now. I process approximately 400 files per day. I have reviewed records from campaigns dating back 200 years. The details change. The names change. The outcomes never change. The Imperium conducts wars that consume soldiers by the millions. The logistic systems that support those wars degrade according to predictable patterns. Soldiers die because supplies do not arrive. The after-action reports document the failures. The next campaign begins. The pattern repeats. I am 58 years old. I have served in the Munitorum for 45 years. I have processed logistics for 21 campaigns. I have allocated supplies that saved some soldiers and denied supplies that killed others. I have participated in a system that consumes human beings as fuel for wars, that accomplish strategic objectives that are never explained in terms that would justify the cost. I have complied with orders and followed protocols and performed my function with competence and efficiency. I have been exactly what the system required me to be. The archive facility is cold, 12 degrees Celsius, the same temperature as the barracks module at Vardis 3, where I slept in my uniform 40 years ago and dreamed about inventory discrepancies. I still have those dreams sometimes. Pallets that do not match their shipping codes. Containers that arrive empty. Supplies that were allocated but never delivered. I wake with the sensation that something has been misplaced, something critical, and I cannot account for it. The data slate I carried from Vardis 3 is still functional. I keep it in my quarters. Sometimes I access the manifests from that first campaign. 14,372 pallets at the beginning, 0 at the end. I allocated everything. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The system was not designed to be enough. It was designed to extract maximum operational capacity from available resources until those resources were exhausted. Soldiers are resources. They are consumed. That is their function. I receive casualty notifications occasionally. Names I recognize from previous deployments. Supply sergeants killed in convoy ambushes. Medics dying at overrun hospitals. Tank commanders lost with their crews. The notifications arrive in my terminal mixed with the historical files I am cataloging. The system does not distinguish between old deaths and new deaths. They are all just data to be archived. Last month, I processed a casualty file from a campaign on a world called Mordaxis 6. The file listed a Medici officer named Kellen Strand who had died at a field hospital after it was overrun. The name was wrong. The first name from one man, the last name from another. But the circumstances were identical. Wounded personnel who could not be evacuated. A Medicae officer who stayed with them, an enemy assault that overran the position. Death at the station. The file was corrupted. Sections were missing. The date did not match. But I archived it with the others because that is my function. I catalog the dead. I enter them into the system. I preserve the record of their consumption. I think about the question Varen asked me, whether it gets easier. The answer is yes and no. The work becomes easier. The decisions become routine. The deaths become statistics. The guilt becomes background process, always running but no longer disrupting primary functions. You learn to carry it. You learn to continue. But the question itself never stops being asked. Every soldier who comes to a depot requesting supplies is asking that question. Whether it gets easier, whether the system will provide what they need, whether their service matters, whether they will survive. The answer is always the same: no, it does not get easier. The system will not provide. Your service matters only as a statistic that contributes to strategic calculations you will never understand. You will probably not survive. And if you do survive, you will become part of the machinery that consumes the next generation. I could have told Varen that. I could have told all of them. The young soldier at Turgus VI, the supply sergeants and tank commanders and Medicae officers, and every other person who passed through my stations asking for supplies that would keep them alive for one more day. I could have told them the truth about what they were part of. But telling them would not have changed anything. They were already part of it. We all were. The system required our participation. Refusal was not an option that existed within the framework we operated in. The Imperium conducts wars across 1,000,000 worlds. Those wars require supplies. The supplies require logistics. The logistics require personnel. The personnel require training. The training produces people like me who can process manifests and allocate resources and make decisions about who receives supplies and who does not. We perform these functions with competence and efficiency. We enable the wars to continue. We are essential components of the system that consumes us. I have no illusions about what I am. I'm a mechanism that converts strategic priorities into individual deaths. I review an allocation request. I assess available resources. I approve or deny based on calculations that optimize resource distributions across competing demands. A unit receives supplies or does not receive supplies. Soldiers live or die. The war continues. My function continues. The system continues. There is no escape from this. Retirement from the Munitorum is not granted to personnel with my level of clearance and institutional knowledge. I will work until I am too impaired to work, and then I will be assigned to some terminal position where I will continue working until I die at my station. The system does not release its components. It consumes them completely. Sometimes I think about what it would require to break the cycle, to disrupt the pattern that repeats across every campaign. The answer is simple. The supply chains would need to function as projected. The logistics would need to match the strategic plans. The resources would need to be sufficient for the wars being fought. But that would require the Imperium to fight fewer wars or to allocate vastly more resources to each war. Neither option is possible within the framework the Imperium operates under. The Imperium is not capable of fighting fewer wars because the threats it faces are endless. The enemy is always advancing. The corruption is always spreading. The frontiers are always under assault. Every world that falls must be reclaimed. Every sector that wavers must be reinforced. The scale of the threat requires constant military operations across the entire extent of imperial space. The Imperium is not capable of allocating more resources because the resources are already stretched to maximum capacity. Every forge world operates at peak output. Every transport is in service. Every soldier who can be conscripted has been conscripted. There are no reserves. There is no surplus. The system functions at the absolute limit of its capability, and that limit is insufficient for the demands placed upon it. So the pattern continues. Wars are fought with inadequate logistics. Supply chains degrade according to predictable timelines. Soldiers die because the supplies they need do not arrive. The casualties are counted. The lessons are documented. The next campaign begins with the same structural flaws embedded in its operational planning. The system perpetuates itself by consuming the components that constitute it. I am one of those components. I have been consumed. I continue to function because functioning is all that remains to me. I process files. I catalog the dead. I preserve the record of a system that has been failing in exactly the same way for centuries and will continue failing in exactly the same way for centuries more, because the system cannot change and the people within it cannot escape. The archive facility is quiet tonight. The ventilation system produces a steady hum that serves as background noise against which I process my thoughts. The terminal displays casualty files from a campaign that concluded 17 years ago. 312,000 dead. The supply chain collapsed in the 19th month of that campaign. By the 24th month, soldiers were fighting hand-to-hand because they had no ammunition. The enemy overran the defensive perimeter. The survivors were evacuated. The world was lost. The after-action report from that campaign recommended maintaining larger supply buffers and improving orbital defense capabilities. The recommendations were identical to the recommendations from every other failed campaign I've reviewed. The recommendations have never been implemented. They will never be implemented. The system knows it is failing. The documentation proves the system knows. But the system is incapable of implementing the solutions it identifies, because implementing those solutions would require resources the system does not possess. This is what the Imperium is. Not an empire, not a civilization, a mechanism for converting human beings into corpses at scale. The mechanism requires logistics. I am the logistics. I am complicit in the conversion. I enable the process. I am the process. Kellen asked me once if I blamed myself. I did not have an answer then. The answer is yes. I blame myself for every allocation I denied that resulted in soldiers dying without supplies. I blame myself for every allocation I approved that diverted supplies from units that needed them more. I blame myself for continuing to function within a system I know is designed to fail. I blame myself for being competent at work that kills people. But blame is not useful. Blame does not change the system. Blame does not save anyone. Blame is simply an emotional response that I have learned to process as background noise, like the ventilation system's hum or the mechanical clicking of the terminal's input keys. I acknowledge the blame. I archive it. I continue functioning. The manifests from Vardis 3 are still on my data slate. I access them sometimes late in the shift when the facility is quiet and there are no other personnel present. I review the numbers. 14,372 pallets at the beginning. I allocated them according to priority matrices and strategic assessments. I performed my function with competence and efficiency. 68,000 soldiers died. The manifest document exactly how the supplies were distributed and exactly when the system collapsed and exactly how many people died as a result. The documentation is precise. The documentation is useless. No one reviews it. No one learns from it. The system generates documentation because documentation is required by protocol. The documentation is archived. The archive grows. The pattern repeats. I am creating documentation right now. This testimony, this account, I do not know who will read it. Possibly no one. Possibly it will simply be archived with all the other documents that preserve the record of the system's failures without changing the system. But I am creating it anyway because creating documentation is my function, and I've been trained to perform my function even when I know the performance is futile. The cold persists. 12 degrees Celsius. The same temperature as the barracks at Vardis 3. The same temperature as the warehouse bays at Gorham Prime. The same temperature as every logistics facility I have worked in across 45 years of service. The cold is constant. The system is constant. The consumption is constant. I am 58 years old. I have processed logistics for wars that killed millions. I have allocated supplies that saved some and denied supplies that killed others. I have participated competently and efficiently in a system designed to consume human beings at scale. I have been exactly what the Imperium required me to be. I'm still processing files. I'm still cataloging the dead. I'm still functioning. That is all that remains. Function. Purpose without meaning. Process without outcome. The system continues because the system is designed to continue. I am part of that design. I cannot escape it. I can only document it and hope that somewhere in the archive of failures and casualties and lessons learned but never implemented, someone will understand what we were part of, what we enabled, what we could not stop. The testimony is complete. The record is preserved. The system continues. I will continue.